My name is Jack Moore. I'm going to be the moderator on the program this afternoon that we are doing from the Heritage Library, and we're going to be discussing a very controversial subject, Judaism and the Christian world. I want to make it very clear right from the beginning that our intentions are not to drum up any hatred of any special group of people, but we want to show you the truth concerning Talmudic Judaism, and we're going to go to its actual source, the Babylonian Talmud, to show you the problems that it poses to you as an American, and particularly if you happen to be American Christian. Rabbinic or Pharisaic Judaism is probably one of the least understood of all of the great world religions, and I think probably one of the reasons is that Christians, for the most part, are literally in an abyss of ignorance concerning the true beliefs and the literature of Judaism itself. Other than what they have read in their Bible, they know very, very little about these people that we call Jews. And then to compound this ignorance that most of our people have, they've been taught in their churches to equate the name Israel and Judah as one and the same people, which is certainly not done in the Bible. I believe, however, that probably most of the major problems that we face stem from the fact that there aren't very many Christians today that realize that modern Judaism is the same as the Pharisaism that Jesus Christ so sternly condemned in the four Gospels of the New Testament. During the 2 centuries that preceded the birth of Jesus Christ, the Pharisee party usurped the traditional offices of the Levitical priesthood, and they began to make the Word of God of none effect by their traditions, as Jesus talked about in Mark 7 and 13. These Pharisees developed a whole new era of Jewish self-righteousness and proclaimed that the Jews were, as a nation, a sort of semi-divine people, and that all people that were non-Jews were also subhuman. So as we look at the Talmud today, we will see confirmed the picture that was painted by our Savior when he described them as hypocrites, children of hell, children of their father the devil, a generation of vipers, and whited sepulchres full of death and corruption. And I think that you'll have to admit that when we get done, that the three of us that are discussing it today will not use terms that are anywhere near as strong as those that were used by Jesus Christ himself. Now, it's quite remarkable how the description that we find of the Pharisees given by Jesus Christ, how it's confirmed in the Talmud. So what I want to do is to give you just a little brief discussion of what the Talmud really is. Now, there are going to be some words that we're going to come across today that are Hebrew words, and there's no way that we can make the pronunciation of these words absolutely correct because we can't speak Hebrew. So as a result, some of them we may mispronounce, and I'm sure that our critics are going to use this as an excuse to find fault with us. So sometimes if we get to an especially hard word, you won't be disturbed, I'm sure, if we'll spell it out to you. The word Talmud gets its name from a Hebrew root word, lamud, which actually means the teaching. And you will find that it's the doctrinal book of all Judaism. It's the Bible of Christianity, actually. And we can say with honesty that the Jews are taught this book in their synagogues, and this is what the rabbinical scholars learn in their seminaries. It's a statement was made a few years ago by a very eminent Jewish writer, a man by the name of Herman Wack. You remember he was the one that wrote a very well-known book on war. And he wrote a book called the Talmud, the Heartblood of the Jewish Faith. It was run as a serial in the November 1959 issue of the New York Herald Times. I want to quote from the first issue that he wrote. He said, "The Talmud to this day is the circulating heart's blood of the Jewish religion. Whatever laws, customs, or ceremonies we observe, whether we are Orthodox Jews, conservative Jews, or Reform Jews, or whether we merely are spasmodic sentimentalists, we follow the Talmud because it is our common law." Now, the rabbis regard Moses as the first author of the Talmud. They said that beside the written law, which was given to Moses at Mount Sinai, God gave to Moses certain oral commandments. They said that's one of the reasons why Moses spent 40 days on Mount Sinai. They said God could have given him the written laws within just an hour or two, but in order to give him all the many oral laws, it took him 40 days for him to learn these things. It's quite interesting if you will compare this teaching with what Jesus said to the Pharisees in John 5:46. Now, I think most of you, if you go to a conventional church, have been taught that the Jews believe in the books of Moses and follow the teachings of Moses. But listen to what Jesus said to them in John 5:46 when they claimed this. He said, if ye had believed Moses, ye would have believed me because he wrote about me. And as I said, this oral law was supposed to have been given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. He was then supposed to have passed it down to Joshua, who in turn gave it to the 70 elders, and these people just kept passing it down generation after generation, adding new statements from the rabbis, until finally the oral law became so large that the scribes in the seminaries in the seminaries of Babylon began to write it down somewhere about 500 BC. In the 2nd century AD, a man by the name of Rabbi Yehuda began to collect all these lists and charts written by these scribes, and they began to put them together into a book that was called the Sefer Mishnah, M-I-S-C-H-N-A-I-O-T-H. It has been shortened until it is popularly called the Mishnah. It means the secondary law. This Mishnah is the very foundation, or we might say the cornerstone of the Talmud, and it's accepted everywhere in the Jewish world. It's the official religious authority and code of Jewish law, and it's the thing that's taught in all the religious academies around the world wherever Judaism is taught. As time began to pass, changes were made in this Mishnah of laws, and the interpretation of the rabbinical doctrine were put into another part of the Talmud that was called the Gemara. In other words, the Gemara is the interpretation of the Mosaic law that was given by these Jewish doctors. In interpreting the Mishnah, the schools of Babylon and Palestine followed their own methods. So today we have two Talmuds, actually. One that is known as the Palestinian Talmud, which is almost unknown among Judaism because it's considered sort of a classical Talmud. The one that we will be discussing today that is followed by modern Judaism is the thing that is called the Babylonian Talmud. And it's a very mammoth volume of books. It's made up of 63 volumes of books in 7 sections. What you see here in front of you today is only one section of the Talmud. These books here deal with the doctrinal laws concerning women alone. And if you can imagine a group of books that would fill a shelf that would be 12 foot long, you can get a little idea of how big this is. They began to write this book about 500 years before Christ, and they completed it about 500 AD in the schools in Alexandria, Egypt. As I said, we've only got 7 of them that we're showing you here today, but we are actually going to be showing you some of the things that are said out of the Talmud using a very interesting book as the background from this. This is a book that was written by Elizabeth Dilling. It was originally called The Plot Against Christianity. It was very successfully used in a Supreme Court decision in the state of Illinois when Elizabeth Dilling was brought into court by the Anti-Defamation League of the Jewish B'nai B'rith and defeated this case over 20 years ago. I'm going to ask Pete Peters on my right here if he'll give you the address where you'll be able to pick up copies of this book. Pete?
Well, Jack, if the audience would write to Scriptures for America, Post Office Box 766, LaPorte, Colorado, and that's a capital L, small a, capital P, LaPorte, Colorado, 80535, and write for a list of literature, and we'll be pleased to send it to you, and you'll find that we have this book listed with the rest of our literature.
Thank you, Pete. Actually, up until around about 1903, none of the copies of the Talmud were written in English. They were in Hebrew. Some of them had been translated into German. In 1903, there was a translation of the Talmud made by a man by the name of Rodkinson. It was a specially sanitized section of the Talmud in which some of the phrases which are critical of Christ and Christianity were taken out. Then in 1934, from 1934 to 1948, there was a new edition of the Talmud that was translated into English from the German that was called the Sansino translation. This is what we'll be discussing today. It was written in English because many of the young Jews in the United States could not read Hebrew, and the only way that they could understand their own Bible was by having an English translation. The only thing that caused trouble was that the Pharisaic rabbis began to find out that if the young Jews could read the Talmud in English, also the non-Jews could read the Talmud in English, and this is where the trouble came in. And you will understand as we discuss today the reason why some of these things took place. Now, I have here, and I think very fortunate, to have with me today two men that I respect a great deal and that I love a great deal for a number of different reasons. One of them is that both of them are dedicated Christians in the very best scriptural meaning of the term dedicated Christians. And they're also patriotic men that love this country of ours and the principles upon which this country was founded. And they're men of courage. They're men that are not afraid to speak out. This young man that you see on my right here is Pastor Pete Peters. He is the pastor of the Church of Christ in LaPorte, Colorado. On my left, this eminent gentleman over here is Pastor Earl Jones of Deming, New Mexico. We'll talk a little bit more about it as we go along. Now, in order for you to understand how the three of us became involved in this study of Judaism and Zionism, because I'm sure some of you are asking, well, why did you, as a Gentile, as a non-Jew, want to get interested in the study of Judaism and the Talmud? So I'm going to ask each one of them to very briefly describe to you the reason why they became involved in this study. And as my mother always taught me that you always start with the elder, we'll ask Brother Earl Jones if he will give you a brief description as to how his curiosity got aroused in the first place and why it was that he became interested in it. Earl, would you do that for us, please?
Thank you, Jack. Actually, my question started very early on in my life. I was born and raised as a Methodist in a Methodist family. I was the bell ringer in the little Methodist church there at home. I took communion. I went to Sunday school. I listened to the preacher from 11 to 12 each day speak on the subject of not only our salvation, but on the subject of God's chosen people. And something was terribly wrong in my mind. It just didn't fit. Just as a young boy, things did not fit because I was raised in a middle-sized industrial city in the Midwest, and there were many people of the Jewish faith there. Now, of course, I didn't realize then that many of these people who were Jewish did not actually go to the synagogue. They were not what you would call practicing Jews, but of course, I didn't know this. But nevertheless, I noticed that among these people, they treated each other in the business sense, they treated each other in the social sense, they treated each other with that degree of righteousness that we think of as righteousness in a way that I just couldn't understand it. I didn't like it. And I thought about this more, and the more I thought about it, I realized that, God, if that is the way you want me to be, I don't want any part of it. And so I left my church, and as I look back those many years ago, I found that in my mind that is perhaps one of the reasons why so many people of the Christian faith have left their churches and have gone home. They see that a situation is existing here where a way of life, the way they not only treat fellow American Christians, but the way they even treat each other.
Don't you think, Earl, that this is particularly true among the young people?
Yes, very much so. Because our young people are very well educated in a lot of the ways that we weren't educated as children. But I saw this, and so I walked out of my church. Well, as I grew into young manhood, I joined the Army right after Pearl Harbor, December the 7th, And my brother and I were both to go down to join the paratroopers, and I couldn't get in because of my glasses. So he went on in as a paratrooper, and I had to go into the artillery, my second choice, joining the Army, and coming from a family long standing all the way back to the Revolutionary War, we had no one who was drafted in our family. So consequently, after the war started, we rushed down to join, and we both went in France at Saint-Mary-Église on the beach. He dropped in, of course, and I went in the artillery. Well, it happened that within a few days he was killed by a German sniper, and I didn't know it for about 30 days. And so when I found out about it from my mother, who had written me a letter, I went back to the little cemetery there at Saint-Mary-Église, and I saw these thousands upon thousands of Christian men, Christian crosses, just row after row, where they were just wooden crosses at the moment, and where they had buried these fine Christian men. And as I walked into the cemetery to find my brother, I saw a young German boy. He was about our age, and I looked at him, and he looked at me, and we just couldn't understand why we were there. It didn't make sense. And here he was, a Christian boy. Here I was, a Christian boy, killing each other. We went on through the war, and of course all of the stories of the war, why we had to be so good to the Russians, etc., just bothered me terribly. And I fought under General Patton, and I knew what General Patton thought about these matters. Well, after the war, I came home and I started studying the geopolitics of what was happening in the world. I studied in the due process actually how communism was started, and that a first revolution, and this wasn't really the first, but the first one really to take Russia, started in about 1907, and it was thwarted and beat down. And I found, and you could even read in National Geographic magazine, where that was entirely Jewish-inspired. It was Jewish-led, Jewish-run, Jewish-financed out of international banking. And I thought again, something was terribly wrong. And here we were, supposedly allies of this great Russian nation, communist nation, and something was bothering me. So in the continued study of the geopolitics of this, I studied who made Talmudism, I studied who made communism, I studied all of the efforts of making a one-world government out of this, and it be a socialist government, but I still couldn't put it together as to why this was taking place, until the Lord led me to learn first who I was. And when He taught me who I was, then it all started to make sense. I could raise my head high. I could be proud to have been a Celto-Saxon. I could be proud to study the history of our people. I could be proud to find out why we were in these problem areas, and in such a manner that I could go forward then to teach it to my brothers and sisters. Because then, all of a sudden, I found that we have a religious thing here. We have a situation where there is the intention via this thing called the Talmud, and these people who use the Talmud as their religion to take over the world in a Zionist-controlled world socialist state. And this brought me to the Talmud and to its intimate study. And consequently, Elizabeth Dilling, in her works, started me on the road. And from there, of course, there have been many works on it, and I have taken great pleasure and great patience in studying as much as I could about the Talmud.
Well, thank you, Earl. I appreciate that. I first became acquainted with Pete Peters, I guess, about 2 years ago, maybe a little bit longer than that ago. when he invited me to come to his church in LaPorte, Colorado, just outside of Fort Collins and about 70 miles north of Denver, to hold a 5-day meeting in the church. And we spoke about communism and the Zionist effect, and all hell broke loose in the community. Not so much from the Jewish community as from the Ministerial Alliance, who were terribly upset with the truth being spoken about. And I grew to love this young man a great deal. I think of him almost as though he was a son of mine. I guess I couldn't probably hardly think any more of a real son of mine than I do of Pete and his wife Sherry. And so I'm real pleased to have Pete with us today on this program. He has a very interesting story to tell, and I think is becoming probably one of the strong arms in the identity movement in the United States today. Pete, would you give us also a little background on how you got involved in this? And
Yes, I'd be pleased to, Jack. It's been said that there's only two things in your life that will really change your life or your outlook, and that is the people you meet and the books you read. Back in the late 60s, I was a student at Colorado State University, and that was back at the time, you might recall, when the leftists were real busy on campus. You were having a lot of demonstrations. It was the time of the Kent State shooting, etc. And I had begun to read some of the material being put out by various conservatives. One, I recall, a book called None Dare Call It Treason. And it was an excellent book, but I began to realize that what was going on our campuses was communist fomented, and that the communists were behind it. I began to recognize that even my economics and my history instructor at the university had very leftist leanings, to say the least. And so as I began to read, I began to have my life change a little bit. I began a little more serious trying to find the truth. I love my country. I didn't want to see it going to the left towards socialism, communism. And at the same time, I began to read another book. It was the Bible. And as a result of that, my senior year at Colorado State University, I became a Christian. Now, remember the church I began to attend. It was the Church of Christ. And there was a fine man there that had also been involved in trying to fight the slide towards communism that this country has been going in for many years. And he said a statement to me that I thought was peculiar. He said, Pete, he said, when you get to the point that I'm at, even the conservatives will persecute you. And at the time he told me that, I thought, well, this was a very strange individual to be talking that way. But he gave me a book, and it's the very one that we're talking about today, The Plot Against Christianity. This book, again, we'll make available. You can order it from us. We'll make that address available towards the end of the program again. But at the time, I didn't read the book. I set it aside. I skimmed through it. A few years went by. I graduated from the university, and I decided that it was God's calling for me to become a minister. And I went off to Bible college. And we need to understand that theologically today, most all of our seminaries are teaching its students, or their students, that the Jewish religion is simply the people that missed the coming of the Messiah, and they're still following the Old Testament. Well, about my second year in Bible college, I ran into the same gentleman that had given me the book. And he made a remark to me. He said, Pete, he said, the Jews believe that for the most part the Bible is for old women, children, and fools. And I think the discussion came up when when he asked me about Judaism. I said, well, it's just the Jews missed the coming of the Messiah, and they're following the Torah, the Old Testament. He made that statement, and he challenged me. And so I went and started studying into it. And as you made reference to earlier, I think you meant to say that the Talmud is the Bible of the Jewish religion. Now, we have seminary students being taught about Mormonism, about Buddhism, Hinduism. They can study into the Quran, this type of thing. But you ask them about Judaism, and they know nothing, no more than I knew at the time that this was laid out to me as a challenge. And I did. I began to study into it, and I can tell you sincerely that if you will study into it yourself, you will find that Judaism is not based upon the Bible, but upon the Talmud. And so it behooves us to know what the Talmud says. And the reason it behooves us, Jack and Earl, is because the way I see it, when you have people in high positions, in positions of authority in finance and in government, it's well for us to understand the theological position they're in, the spiritual position. You cannot understand that in regards to Judaism until you study into the Talmud. As a result of studying into the Talmud, I began to realize that this was just diametrically opposed to Christianity. At the same time, the question started coming to my mind, well now, if the people called Jews follow this, How can they be God's chosen people? The next thing that started coming to my mind is if they are not God's chosen people, who are? And I also began to realize that there was another mistake being taught in the seminaries. I know I was taught wrong in Bible college on this position. That is, the word Jew and the word Israel is not synonymous. But today you will hear ministers all across the land as they're rapidly telling Christians and Americans that we've got to be good to Israel. You'll hear them call Moses a Jew. They'll call David a Jew. They'll call Joseph a Jew. But yet when you pick up the Bible, you will find nowhere in the Bible where these people were called Jews. They were Israelites. They were Hebrews. They were descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, people destined to form a multitude of nations. As a result of study, meeting some additional scholars, I began to realize that the true Israelite people of Scripture are the ones that settled this nation and that have carried forth the cross, the gospel of Christ, to the rest of the world. That's a brief overview. You have to go to it in steps. And I was always taught one thing correctly in Bible college, and that is that truth does not fear investigation. And if you investigate this, you begin to see that this is the way it is. And this is all from a objective standpoint. There is another way to approach this, and I think that you made reference to it, and it ought to be brought out again. Subjectively, the question comes to my mind, why is it that when I begin to teach openly concerning what the Jewish connections are in regards to communism, when I begin to talk about the Talmud, when I have a speaker such as yourself into my church, at the LaPorte Church of Christ in LaPorte, Colorado, why is it that all of a sudden the media brings their attention towards you, and all of a sudden you're being labeled such terms as hatred and etc.? And so subjectively, something tells me that something's wrong out there, because I'm still a Christian that I was before. But this seems to be a truth that I'm not allowed to put out to the people. It seems to be a taboo. That this
Neo-Nazi.
Yes, neo-Nazi.
Yeah.
I don't even know what a neo-Nazi is, or at least I haven't until you're called a neo-Nazi for 100 times. But what's going on? And I think subjectively you'll find that you can talk about anything you want in this country. But if you begin to talk about the Jewish issue, your entire life will change. I know that since we've had you at our church, I've been on radio talk shows that have covered the entire continent of America. I've been on television talk shows. I've been in the media. I've had New York Times call me. And it tells me that this is a delicate nerve. And because the Bible says that truth is the thing that will set its people free, and if this is true, I think we should talk about it. Of course, we're doing it today. And that's sort of a brief overview of what happened in my life.